Welcome to the pioneering video of this channel. My intention is to present videos analyzing a very wide array of historical and contemporary topics and issues. In future, I also intend to host interactive discussions. This video will be in two parts and will analyze the historical reasons why I think black people seem to be under the boot and have hence been placed at the bottom of the pile. I have decided to make this video because I think it is important to have accurate knowledge of what has happened in the past in order to know how to tackle the future. The areas that I think clearly summarize this analysis are academia, religion, slavery and colonization, and legacy. In part 1, under academia, I will discuss the first widely accepted classification of different races. Under religion, I will discuss the impact Islam had on the trans-Saharan slave trade. I will also discuss the impact Christianity had on the transatlantic slave trade. Under slavery and colonization, I will discuss the European invasion of Africa, widely referred to as the Scramble for Africa, the fierce and protracted resistance by African peoples, and the resulting European colonization of African peoples. In part 2, this video will conclude with the legacies of the transatlantic slavery and European colonization of Africa in the form of racial discrimination, past and present. This video will lay the foundation for topics that will be discussed in future. As much as possible, sources of information will be referenced. Kindly leave your remarks in the comment section, as they will go to help improve future video production and research. If you have alternative points of view or wish to discuss any of the points that have been mentioned, your comments are also very welcome. Kindly subscribe to the channel and click the notification button in order to promote its distribution on the platform. I would like to acknowledge some of the articles and YouTube clips referenced in this video. The list can be found in the description box. Later on,
I, as much as any other man, am in favor of having the superior position assigned to the white race.
We have been engaged in drawing lines upon maps where no white man's foot has ever trod. We have been giving away mountains and rivers and lakes to each other, only hindered by the small impediment that we never knew where the mountains, rivers, or lakes were.
When you study Africa, you will find that the First World War was fought over Africa, and so was the Second World War.
We do everything to keep sub-Saharan Africa where it is, also impoverished. It's absolutely vital for the prosperity of everyone else. So let's get clear about that.
later on in part 2.
Back and find out what Leopold did. 25 million people killed in Congo, hands chopped off, and chocolate bars made in the form of hands. And the Belgians will be eating chocolates to celebrate the death of the Africans. When I get into the atrocities of the European and colonial system, particularly the slave trade and the Congo genocide, I actually get upset. Ask me why. Why?
I remember watching Alex Haley's Roots when it was released in the UK in 1977. To date, it has been the most memorable, profound, and influential series that I have ever watched. I remember questions that have stuck in my mind. Why are black Africans so widely discriminated against? Why were my ancestors shipped across the Atlantic Ocean like animals into chattel slavery? Why does black history as told by Europeans seem to be incomplete? Why does it appear that black Africans have the richest continent but the poorest people? Why have Islam and Christianity taken such a foothold in Africa? Over the decades, I have asked myself and many others these questions and many more like them. Those questions and others like them are the inspiration for this video. During the course of this video, I will be asking and answering some very important questions. I hope you enjoy it and that it encourages and inspires you to go and undertake your own research into the topics covered. Let's look at the effects of academia on race classification. Francois Bernier, a French physician and traveler, is believed to have developed the first comprehensive classification of humans into distinct races. His work in this area was published in a French journal article in 1684. The article was published anonymously in one of the earliest academic journals published in Europe. The article was titled New Division of the Earth by the Different Species or Races of Man that Inhabit It. In his classification, he clearly placed white Europeans as the norm from which other races deviated. In the 1750s, a Swedish naturalist, Carl Linnaeus, went further in his classification. He believed that the human species comprised 4 distinct races: Americanus, from the continent of the Americas; Europeus, from the continent of Europe; Asiaticus, from the continent of Asia; and Africanus, from the continent of Africa. Linnaeus described the following categories: skin color, physical traits, behavior, manner of clothing, and form of government. He came up with the following definitions. Americanus: red, choleric, and straight black and thick hair, gaping nostrils, freckled face, beardless chin, unyielding, cheerful, free, paints himself in a maze of red lines, governed by customary right. Europeus: white, sanguine, and muscular, plenty of yellow hair, blue eyes, light, wise, inventor, protected by tight clothing, governed by rights. Asiaticus: sallow, melancholic, stiff, blackish hair, dark eyes, stern, haughty, greedy, protected by loose garments, governed by opinions. Africanus: black, phlegmatic, lazy, dark hair with many twisting braids, silky skin, flat nose, swollen lips. Description of sexual characteristics follow here. Sly, sluggish, neglectful, anoints himself with fat, governed by choice. From the summary table, it can be seen very clearly that the people of the African continent are considered inferior. As a side note, this is an interesting classification by a European who, although widely traveled, clearly did not care to understand any African people's cultures or traditions. Even more interesting is that this incorrect observation could have been so widely accepted as an academic fact for centuries. Another thing to note is how this widely accepted classification incorrectly assumes the subraces on any of the continents are a monolith. Let's look at the effects of religion on race classification. What was the effect of Islam on the enslavement of black Africans? Many moons ago, Islam had spread into northern Africa around the 7th century AD. only a few decades after the Prophet Muhammad moved with his followers from Mecca to Medina. About a century after the Prophet's death, Spain had been conquered by Arab armies and Islam spread to Europe. Between the 8th and 9th centuries, Arab merchants, slave traders, travelers, then African clerics began to spread Islam along the eastern coast of Africa and to the western and central Sudan. This stimulated the development of urban communities. Muslim slave traders exported around 8 million African slaves to southern Europe and Asia Minor between 700 and 1400 AD. Little is known about their contribution to the economy of the Mediterranean world. What was the effect of Christianity and the Church on the enslavement of black Africans? Records tell us that the transatlantic slave trade began around the 15th century. One of the first records of the inhuman transatlantic slave trade is that of a Portuguese slave ship captained by Antão Gonçalves. Gonçalves' voyage to the western coast of Africa was in 1441. Legal traditions in Iberia during the 15th century gave directives on how Christians were to treat Jews, Muslims, and other Christians, clearly describing, for example, who could be enslaved and who not. In 1452, Pope Nicholas V issued a papal bull that granted Portugal the right to enslave sub-Saharan Africans. A papal bull is a type of public decree, letters patent, or charter issued by a pope of the Catholic Church. It is named after the leaden seal traditionally appended to authenticate it. The papal directive was to the Portuguese king Alfonso V. The papal bull instructed him to go to the western coast of Africa and invade, capture, vanquish, and subdue all Saracens and pagans and other enemies of Christ, to reduce their persons to perpetual slavery, and to take away all their possessions and property. A Saracen, as referred to in the papal edict, meant an Arab or Muslim. A pagan meant a person who is not religious or whose religion is not Christianity, Judaism, or Islam. At that time, black sub-Saharan Africans were referred to by the Roman Catholic and European churches as pagans. That papal directive instructing Alfonso to enslave Africans was reissued in 1455, 1456, 1481, 1493, 1506, and 1514. As the 1452 papal bull indicates at first, the Church officially limited African slave trading to Alfonso of Portugal. In effect, Portugal got permission from the Pope to practice slavery on condition that it should try to convert the slaves to Christianity. Regardless, other European groups soon followed. The language in the papal bull weighed heavily on the concept of domination of the lands and peoples. Domination derives from the Latin word domo, which means to subjugate, to subdue, to force into subservience, to tame, to domesticate, to cultivate, to till. During the late 15th and 16th centuries, Portuguese, French, and English mariners either raided African communities or traded with them for merchandise and African slaves. The complicity of European churches in the transatlantic slave trade is a discussion for another video. The regions in Africa that the Europeans assaulted following the papal bulls were places of high culture and development. One of the earliest descriptions of the east coast of Africa was written in the 2nd century AD. It comes from a sailor's guide, probably compiled in Alexandria in modern-day Egypt. It demonstrates that routes along the coast of East Africa were at the time of writing well sailed and important for trade. The document shows respect for East Africans. It talks of the land of Oceania, where there is much ivory and tortoiseshell. Men of the greatest stature inhabit the whole coast, and at each place have set up chiefs. At this point, I will make reference to Professor Small's lecture in African Studies.
So, as we looked at some of the ancient history, if you go backwards, as I was showing you the other day, this institution, this particular one, this Ipet Isut, it was a university system. Plato studied there, Aristotle studied there for some short period. Thales was the first major Greek to study there.
The mass enslavement of black Africans by Europeans was eventually followed by the transatlantic slave trade. Between 1520 and 1888, European slave traders transshipped around 15 million Africans as slaves to the Americas. 12 to 15 generations of African people lived as slaves in the Americas. The total slaves deployed over the 370 years in the Americas may have been considerably more than 100 million at the time when the world population was less than 1 billion. The transatlantic slave trade, which was extremely brutal, introduced a system of slavery that was commercialized, racialized, and inherited. To facilitate the capture of slaves, some African tribes were supplied with the best weaponry at the disposal of the Europeans. It caused a multitude of slave wars between African tribes that lasted for centuries. The deployment of the African slaves in Europe and the Americas was immoral, inhuman, and one of the worst crimes against humanity. Slavers and slave owners whipped and punished slaves who displeased them. The clergy preached that slavery was the will of God. Scientists such as Francois Bernier and Carl Linnaeus falsely proved that black people were less evolved, a subspecies of the human race. The last point resulted in extremely inhumane treatment of black people. An example: in 1932, in the United States, 600 African American men were deliberately infected with syphilis by government-sponsored physicians. They were also deliberately denied treatment even when it was available. The aim of the study, known as the Tuskegee study, being to observe the natural history of untreated syphilis in black populations. The experiment ran for 40 years until 1972. Back to the religious aspects of black people being placed at the bottom of the pile. This map illustrates the current spread of the two major religions in Africa, Islam and Christianity, both of which have had an extremely profound impact on every aspect of development of the continent. It also tells a story of how over the centuries, the two major religions have influenced the continent's socio-economic constructs with regards to race classification and the negative aspects of its systemic legacies, racism and colonialism, to mention a couple. In other words, Africa became a melting pot with the legacies of both Islam and Christianity, bringing more socio-economic and political regression than progress. What was the effect of Islam and Christianity spreading across Africa? A combination of race classification by Europeans and the spread of religion across Africa was partially responsible for the European scramble for the continent. Before the scramble for Africa, there had been missionaries and explorers all over the continent who in reality had acted as reconnaissance agents for various European governments.
But no one goes back to the 1800s. And no one goes back to the white missionaries all over Africa who's posing as missionaries but sending back logistical information on what river is the best and most navigable, where is the mineral, the geologists are there sending back where is the mineral resources. Others are saying what is the best farmland, and so forth and so on. So in 1890, they decided to invade Africa, and what should be called the First World War takes place starting in the 1890s with the attack on Africa from the north by the French, from the northeast by the British, from the Horn by the Italians and the French, from the west by the Spanish and the Portuguese and the French and the British, from the central west by the Belgians, from the south by the Dutch and the Finns and the Germans, and from the east and southeast by the Germans. All of them attacked Africa simultaneously, and it is not even referred to as a war.
The scramble for Africa, or a more apt description being the invasion of Africa, is the name given to the way in which European countries brought the African continent under their control as part of their separate empires. The scramble for Africa began in the 1880s. At this time, Europeans had industrial weaponry at their disposal, which the African tribes and brave soldiers could not match.
Africa, and you can see the size of it, and Europe, you can see the size of it. Then one would say, how did this little group of people beat this big group of people? First of all, this big group of people didn't invade this little group of people with an intent of killing or destroying them. Indeed, didn't invade them at all. But this group of people invaded this group of people with the intent of killing and destroying them. In the 1890s, there was a big conference in Europe. Anybody know what that conference called? It was a conference on Africa. It's one of the most significant conferences in the history of the world. Do you know what that conference is titled in history? What is it called? It's called the Berlin Conference.
The Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885 was the planning stage for the eventual invasion, annexation, division, and colonization of most of Africa by 7 European countries. The conference met on 15th November 1884 and concluded on 26 February 1885 with the signature of a General Act regulating the European colonization and trade in Africa during the new imperialism period.
The importance of this to our journey is that Congo was then seized by King Leopold in 1876. That act of seizure by a small country who wasn't even a great power of the time led the great powers to think, hang on, this guy could go for more African territory. And that gave birth to the conference that is now known as the Berlin Conference. But at that time, it was called the African Conference, except there were no Africans at the conference. The great powers met and they divided up the territory into parcels of land that they then presumed to own. The only thing was that they said each power must be able to exercise effective control. And where one power had effective control, the other power would have to yield possession to that country. And that's what was called the scramble to establish effective occupation. It was so bad that Lord Salisbury said, we have been engaged in drawing lines upon maps where no white man's foot has ever trod. We have been giving away mountains and rivers and lakes to each other, only hindered by the small impediment that we never knew where the mountains, rivers, or lakes were.
This scramble and eventual colonization took place amidst a vicious inter-empire rivalry between European states between 1885 and 1945.
When you study Africa, you will find that the First World War was fought over Africa, and so was the Second World War.
Professor Small explains this in his lecture.
When the fighting was finished and the bloody wars had been fought, the Germans was left with the short end of the stick. Notwithstanding, they had called the conference in the first place to cut Africa up between the Europeans. But now Kaiser finds himself cut out of the deal by the turn of the century, the 1900s. And he said, look, unless you give me a better piece of the land, because they hadn't discovered uranium in Namibia yet, and he didn't realize the true value of the farmland in Tanzania to the economy of Europe yet. So stuck with Tanzania and Namibia, which is mostly a desert, the Germans hit the ceiling. And when the Germans couldn't get a better deal on the African mineral resources, Germany went to war to find those resources in Europe. And where did they go? They went after what? Alsace-Lorraine in France. What mineral resources is there? Or Alsace-Lorraine. The coal fields of Europe is in that part of France. They went for Poland. What is in Poland? The timberland of Europe is in Poland. And then they went for the Rhineland. What was in the Rhineland? The best farmland, or the breadbasket of Europe. That's what Germany did, because they cut Germany out of a significant piece of Africa, with French getting the cream of the crop and the British getting significantly next to the French. The Portuguese had Angola and Mozambique and the Guinea-Bissau and the Cape Verdes. So Portugal was sitting nice with its big sugarcane plantations and its mining and so forth. The British were sitting nice because the British ends up in Sudan, in Egypt, in Kenya, and Uganda, while the Belgians got the richest of all. Leopold, the king of Belgium, gets Zaire, or what was then the Congo, which was the center of mineral wealth at that point.
During the turbulent period of the two world wars and the Great Depression that followed the scramble for Africa, the economic and political blood was sucked out of African colonies by European countries in their struggle to survive. By 1914, the only African countries not controlled by European power were Liberia, which is de facto a US colony, and Ethiopia, which is known then as Abyssinia. European colonization of Africa was motivated by various reasons, including economic exploitation, strategic interests, religious and cultural motivations, and national pride. There was a high level of coordinated invasion and brutality that was eventually carried out by European countries in Africa on the peoples. An interesting fact that is not widely known in comparison to the invasion of Africa is that all over the continent, the resistance to the invasion was not only fierce but protracted. Professor Small explains this in his lecture.
Were you ever told about the struggle for Fashada, which is a point on the Nile River, this bend down in Sudan, where the fork goes into Sudan and into Ethiopia? Did they ever explain while the British with the Arab Egyptians began to invade the Sudan, the Italians began to invade Ethiopia, the French invade Morocco and Algeria, the Spanish invade Mauritania and what is now called Sahara, the French invade what is Senegal, Mali area, while the Portuguese invaded what is part of Guinea area, while the British invades, again, what is Nigeria and Ghana, and the German invades what is Gabon, Congo, and Angola, and Namibia. But the Portuguese controls Angola, so the Germans had to run down to Namibia. And in all of this, the African is launching fierce resistance. These wars are lasting for decades, but it's not even called a war. Some great generals are born and die in these wars. Most of you, any of you, have you ever heard of a general called Tippy II? This is the man who led the resistance in Zaire against the Belgians. An enormous war being fought with bows and arrows against cannons and rifles. The extent to which they defended their territory is enormous to understand, and would have won the war had it not been for the death and the assassination of Abdallah, who was the leader of the Sudanese forces once commanded by Muhammad Ahmed, who's called the Mahdi. And Abdallah got caught blind at his back by the British and the Egyptians because the Ethiopians capitulated, and instead of defending the flag coming from the east, took money to stay neutral. Most people think of Shaka Zulu. There was nobody named Shaka Zulu. There was an emperor of the Zulu people named Shaka. Shaka, emperor of the Zulus. But to disrespect him, they won't call him an emperor. He's Shaka Zulu. But Shaka, emperor of the Zulu, never engaged the whites. He never had one single battle with whites. He never fought a war with any white groups. Shaka's activities was around organizing the Zulu nation. And there was some warring between him and those forces he forced into the federation that became the Zulu nation. But the man who took on the European is called Bimbata, General Bimbata, emperor of the Zulu nation. And you've never heard of General Bimbata, who slaughtered in one battle more Europeans on that occasion than had ever been killed in a single battle in history before. And it was on the forces of Bimbata, that is the first time the Gatling gun is used in Africa in recorded history. And in one day's shooting, they killed nearly 30,000 Zulu troops using those weaponry. And once that gun is introduced, the entire war across the continent is changed, and history is altered almost permanently. But you need to understand that, and what you need to understand is that some of the wars lasted for more than 50 years. One particular one is the Portuguese attack on Angola. Who was the queen that led the Angola people fought a 50-year war against the Portuguese before they signed a peace treaty? You never heard of Queen Anne Zanga, who had become Christian trying to make peace with the Portuguese, and that's where the Anne came from. She took the name Anne as a Christian name in solidarity with these people, hoping that they can have peace if they adopted these people's sacred way, and these people supposedly converted to the Angolan people sacred way. But it didn't work. And so for 50 years, she defended the coastline against the Portuguese incursion and kept them virtually on the coast as far as where their cannons could shoot.
Should this have been recorded as the First World War? This is a selection of resistances to the European invasion and colonialism in Africa. As we scroll through, ask yourself how many you have ever heard of. At this juncture, we could also discuss the exploits of the British on the Asian continent. During nearly 200 years of colonialism, the British Empire caused at least 100 million deaths in India in about 40 years, in addition to stealing at least $45 trillion in wealth from India, according to an academic study. We could also discuss what the Dutch, British, French, and Spanish did in North America, or what the British, French, Spanish, Portuguese, and Dutch did in South America and the Caribbean islands, but these are discussions for future videos. So far, we have analyzed how the spread of Islam in Africa enhanced the trans-Saharan slave trade, which resulted in the mass enslavement of millions of Africans. We have also seen how the spread of Christianity in Africa is not only associated with the transatlantic slave trade, but was a direct result of repeated edicts from the highest authority of the Roman Catholic Church with the collusion of other European churches. We have also seen how these injustices resulted in the negative conclusions of the first widely accepted academic classifications of the human race, which would have long-lasting effects on people of African origin. Thanks for watching so far. Hope you're enjoying the journey. Join me in part 2 for the conclusion of our journey.